Welcome back to the innovation stage. Our next presentation, we're going to hear about interacting well with the outside community. So ESOP companies really do have an advantage because they have such great relationships with their employee owners, but they also have great potential relationships with the broader community. So some of the research that's been funded, supported by the Employee Ownership Foundation, has shown that customers and that potential employees have a natural affinity for employee-owned companies. The fact that you have an ESOP company means that you automatically have an advantage when it comes to attracting customers and attracting potential employees. But if you're not going to interact well with your community, you're going to undercut that advantage not only for yourself, but for everyone else in the ESOP community. So let's learn how to do that well, how to avoid potential mistakes from Jay Vincent.
Hey, good morning, everybody. So I think you'd agree that businesses that are successful, that are able to send people to Las Vegas to participate in conferences like this, are successful, right? They're successful at knowing what the market forces that their business is operating within and how they're going to affect them, right? They looking ahead, thinking, what kind of employees do we need next year? They're looking ahead and saying, what are the sales going to be next year? Businesses are inherently good at these things, at least the ones that I talk to, because they can afford to pay for me, or they can afford to actually have a place for me to meet with them, right? So they're good fundamentally at doing what businesses do: sell their products, care for their employees, fund their pensions, etc. But one thing that companies are not as good as they ought to be are understanding some of these non-market forces. And so what are some of these non-market forces? Let's advance these slides here a little bit. So these non-market forces are things like the political environment, things like the regulatory environment. But there are other non-market forces today that are emerging that are even more serious for folks to deal with. And some of those are just generally considered social forces, right? So in advanced democracies with stable regulatory environments, we're able to operate our businesses and be successful because there's a bit of predictability, right? There's essentially something that we call, and we'll get to this in a little bit, social license, right? There is this understanding that it is safe to operate here. That's why we have foreign direct investment in this country, right? Countries are willing to sink their treasuries into our economy, knowing that this is going to grow over time. But some of these things, some of these forces are beginning really to kind of undermine the companies, undermine this social license. And what's the evidence that we have for this? Harken back to maybe 5 years ago. A well-heeled company, Walmart, definitely not employee-owned, is under attack. Who are they under attack from? They're under attack from competitors. They're under attack from political parties. They're under attack from social activists. In general, they are in a full frontal war with all sorts of external forces that they were wholly unprepared to deal with. And this meant that literally hundreds of stores that they had proposed had gone away. They were not going to be built. Communities rose up and said, you know what? You can't build this here. You know what? You can't have that tax increment financing. And so a variety of these forces are coming together to really damage their ability to grow. So they need to take a look at some of these key external forces. And there are really some simple ways, I think, for us to think about these non-market forces and how you can really take a look out into the world and see them, analyze. Are they exactly the worry point that they ought to? Are they as big of a risk to your business as they may seem? And so to do that, you have to kind of take a step outside yourself a little bit. And there's this thought that I have is let me go back here. When we lead with what we want, often we don't get what we need. And so what do I mean? You know, today, people, and these are your customers, these may be your employees' families, these may be future customers, or really just generally American society. There is a different set of expectations that people have for the ways that they will be treated by government, the ways that they will be treated by companies, and all sorts of other different kind of entities that they interact with. So you really need to take a look outside and not be so focused on what you want. Because when people see you, whether you're knocking at their door for the first time to make a sales pitch, or you're on the phone to see if they're willing to take a meeting with you, if you're not curious about what they want, if you're not curious about what motivates them, often they just kind of disregard you. And in the case of these social, political, regulatory forces, they really can have an impact on your ability to operate. So instead of me kind of pontificating about these thoughts, I want to kind of really give you some tactical ways and share with you some of the kind of capabilities I see inside firms that are hallmarks really of solid external affairs organizations. So what do I mean about a kind of external affairs organization? Has anybody heard of these or read these scholarly articles recently about the rise of the chief marketing officer or the rise of the chief accounting officer, right? It's kind of a bit grandiose, a bit of hyperbole, but what they're signifying, and I think this is very much goes to what Patrick said when he introduced me, is that there is data that shows that there are things that we need to be paying attention to, and there are advantages that we have. And so we need to leverage those advantages, and we need to be thinking differently about what is going on in the external environment. Why are these people, why are these entities treating us differently than they have in the past? So we really see kind of three key capabilities, and they're based on strategy, they're based on organization, and then they're based on stakeholder engagement. And I'm not sure if folks are familiar exactly with what stakeholder engagement means. It's a body of work that I'm involved in significantly, so if you have questions after we finish, I'm happy to answer them. But strategy-based, what do I mean here? Firms that have this capability really have it baked into their strategic planning process. I'll eventually get a handle on this, Patrick. So it's built right into their corporate strategic planning process, and that's critical. Because today, regardless of what you think right now in this moment, if you don't know who your key external stakeholders are, eventually they will feel like you don't care for them, like you're not paying attention to them, and that their interests are not aligned with yours. And eventually those become business challenges, or at least challenges with your customers. So the other last piece is this bit about prioritizations of the agenda based on the value at stake. So I'm sure anybody that's met with a public affairs person, I know the marketing folks used to have to deal with this frequently, but this is generally considered, right, the soft science. And so C-suite officers may say, well, what's the real value to the enterprise here? And there is a significant value to the enterprise if we're able to step outside of only assuming that this is about dollars and cents. Eventually, as I see customers and I see companies kind of approaching this, trying to figure out and quantify this value, eventually they do get to something that's really grounded in something that's quantified in an impact to their business and an impact to their operating budget. But there are other really values here, I think, that you need to think about. One of those values is anchored in when you take a look at the outside world and you find stakeholders that may care about your business, and people that really have no financial involvement in your business. They may use your product. They may be an evangelist for your product. Those people in today's world, in fact, I think you heard a speaker today talking about connectional intelligence. Those people today are incredibly valuable for your business. They can help you sell products that you normally wouldn't have sold in the past. So really taking a look in the outside world and understanding who these key external stakeholders are really can have an immediate value impact on your business. So organizational, some of these capabilities that are, there we go, kind of some of the hallmarks of organizations that have these capabilities built in, their CEO is actively involved. Today, there is no job that is below the chief executive officer in a company. Companies that operate, I think, from an authentic leadership style, the CEO is willing to go in and fold envelopes with somebody one day, be out in the road with the government affairs director the next, and then be out in a sales call with maybe a new sales supervisor. Whether you're a small, medium, or large enterprise, these sorts of behaviors have an incredible positive impact on the organization. So one of the others is expertise in economic analysis and stakeholder engagement, not just at lobbying and industry group participation. What do I mean here? To think that we're at this conference and this is enough to look on the outside world and understand the issues that are impacting our business, it is not enough today, right? There are a variety of different sorts of businesses here that need to focus on the external world and understand how the outside world might impact their business in the future. But lobbying isn't enough. participating in the trade associations is not enough. And why? Well, lobbying is essentially an entity taking their position and trying to get their way with that position, either with regulators or with the government. And today, getting your way is no longer something that even the well-heeled can guarantee, right? People are starting to participate, not so much in voting, but they're beginning to participate in these regulatory and other political avenues in a way that is having a detrimental impact on business and on all sorts of aspects of society. So being anchored in a position is the antithesis of if we lead with what we want, often you don't get what you need. So to move away from that position, we need to take a couple of steps. So if we're debating, you have your position, I have my position, there might be an opportunity to explore something more along the lines of a shared interest. So if we're anchored in this position, in these positions, but we know we both want to enhance the marketplace, maybe we can fall back on that and live there for a little while, live there in that shared interest. And if we get back even another step further, we start where kind of usually these debates all begin, is in this kind of critical shared value. And you eventually want to move back to that place if you're going to be able to create lasting change. So remember, lobbying is not being effective at external affairs. It's not government affairs. External affairs is really a merger or an integration of marketing, government affairs, public affairs, and all the external ways that your company faces the world. So integrating them into not necessarily a new organization. I'm not going to be up here pontificating about the rise of the Chief External Affairs Officer or anything like that. Instead, really beginning to look at these things begins to uncover a lot of opportunity. So a lot of opportunity for the organization. Now the last here is stakeholder engagement. Early engagement with key stakeholders. If you don't know who your key stakeholders are, we're going to get into some of the tactics that you should look at immediately to help you to get a sense of what I'm talking about here. But bringing people in to the decision-making process. My professional association is not the Association of Management Consultants. It's not the Association of Public Relations. Instead, it's this one that I know, I will guarantee 100% no one in this room has ever heard of. It's the International Association of Public Participation, and it's focused on stakeholder engagement. Why is that important for the business? Well, I think it's especially important for employee-owned businesses because public participation says that people have the right to participate in the planning of the processes that will impact their lives. In a way, the companies that you own operate just like that, don't they? You're in that business, not maybe just because you want to sell that car wash or you want to sell some sort of engineering service. You're in it because your time, your value gets kind of organized and valued in a completely different way. So there's some real powerful stuff when you start talking to the world about what it is that you do well, what is it that you do bad, what is it you can do better, what is it that you might do in the future for some of those customers. So really be thinking about how when you're planning for next year, how can you bring in outside stakeholders into that process, right? Why shouldn't a vendor be there, maybe at the table early with you to talk about how you might want to reduce the days outstanding on some of your accounts receivable, and the steps you're going to take from moving from 50 days to 45 days. Wouldn't those folks want to participate in that process? Wouldn't they want to share with you a kind of a better way to do it? So bringing people into the process is really what this is about. And there's a hunger for it out there. There's a reason why people participate in local government today more than they ever have. My firm did a survey a couple of years ago. We wanted to know how many people across the whole country have participated in some supportive or protestive movement in local government, meaning they made a phone call to a legislator or a city councilor. They sent a letter to the zoning department, either to support or oppose. How many people do you think, or what percentage of Americans do you think said they'd done this once in the past 2 years? 73% of Americans said they had somehow opposed or supported a project in the past 2 years. Now, when we first did this survey in 2010, this was around 60%. I would never have guessed it was even as high as 60% then. But to see it grow so substantially over a couple of year period was pretty impressive. That just tells me that you really need to be focused on what's going on in the outside world. So these are some of the categories of capabilities, right? What I want to get into is the hallmarks of some of these external topics. Once you've kind of decided that you're going to take a look at the world and try to figure it out, maybe develop an initial agenda for thinking about engaging with your external stakeholders, there are going to be some things or activities or tactics that you're going to want to use with these people. So the next part of this is going to talk kind of really deeply about this. So successful companies are great at sustaining relationships with key stakeholders in a systemic process. So think about your association, actually, to give you a real-world example of how this might work, right? You get regular communications. You might not know what those communications are going to be from month to month, but you know the frequency of those communications. You know that you're going to get an email from the membership director. You know that you're going to get an email from your chapter director, et cetera. All of that is part of a strategy that has a plan, and the things that you get are essentially the tactical parts of that plan. So that's the systemic process. Whether it's a complex process or a simple process, what's important is that you've planned it, you've written it down, and now there is a plan there for you to go off of. Now, many of the customers that I work for do really wonderful things in the community. You know, they spend millions, some of them tens of millions of dollars a year to support the United Way, to help fish habitat and ruffed grouse habitat. And often they tell no one about this. And that is really a critical failure. But that's grounded in something that used to work. Our company is so humble. We give out all this money. We're going to tell no one because we do it because it's really our altruistic purpose that we do this. A big part of that is frankly unbelievable, right? You're investing in this ruffed grouse society because you're impacting tens of thousands of acres of wetlands and ruffed grouse habitat by building your pipeline, for instance. So really what is their desire not to talk about this is because it's probably grounded in the fact that they don't want people to know that they're disturbing this habitat, yet they are mitigating it with this investment. That's a mistake. Additionally, there are things that businesses do that are internal, that people, and going back to some of my pipeline companies, I'll give you a good example of this, but they're inside their companies, they're doing these things, they're using their processes to make sure that they do this in a just and equitable way. And then when they get out there, the community says, boy, that doesn't look just and equitable to me. That is a big problem. But if you show people how you went from this idea and used your process to get to what you believed was just and equitable, they may be more understanding of that. Maybe not so willing to judge you negatively for that sort of presentation. So communicate directly with folks that you're donating dollars to. And somehow, really the outreach experts, the company I founded, our tagline is transform allies into advocates. If the people that you're contributing to are not your allies, then you might consider donating to people that are different and that will be your allies. But if you have an ally, you ought to be able to motivate them to an advocate, whether they're advocating for you as a regulatory body or advocating for you with a future customer or with another vendor. The reality is these folks need to be saying nice things about you. Successful companies also do another thing well. They identify and they monitor and they understand their stakeholders in a really deep way. So identify, profile, and monitor. This first step is really critical. If you don't know who they are and it's not written down somewhere, it really doesn't exist. I can remember that from the first political training I ever did. My field director said, hey, I think it's great, you've got a great plan in your mind, but I've got nothing to measure you against. I've got nothing to make sure that you're doing your work until it's actually written down into a plan. And that thought, which was probably in 1999, has really carried its way throughout my career. If it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So identify them, build a profile, and then monitor them. What does that mean? You're interacting with these folks, people inside your business are interacting with these folks. There are ways today that you can easily monitor them. You can have people tracking emails that are sent, building that information into your corporate social responsibility report. You can build a profile that includes their social media handles and understand what they're saying. Are they engaging with your business on social media, et cetera? So today, these three things, identify, monitor, and profile, are really, they're best practices in a way, but as my business school professor taught me, best practice is really just orthodoxy. And if you're not doing the things that are orthodox, what happens to your business? Your business falls behind. Because a business that is doing the non-orthodox may be the one that's innovative. The one that is not doing the basics of orthodoxy is one that eventually is in the heap. So prioritizing stakeholders based on interest and influence. This is just a really simple tactic that I think, if anything, you'll be able to take away from this talk and use in understanding who is important for you to spend time on. Because often the reason that businesses are not doing this work is because there are other things that you all have to do in that business. This takes kind of the second seat to what you're doing. Until you grow in the business and you decide that you want to have a director of external affairs or somebody kind of responsible for that, a simple way to understand the importance of someone or to figure out if they're a key stakeholder is to do a simple quadrant analysis. So on the x-axis, we have interest. On the y-axis, we have influence. And in the upper right quadrant, if you can see this in your mind, that's where all the key stakeholders are. These are key people who are highly interested and that have lots of influence. And you can use on the x or y axis a scale of 1 or 2, a scale of 1 to 10. It all depends on how sophisticated you want to get about it. But in the end, the folks that are up in that upper right quadrant, that's where you want to live. You want to spend all your time talking to those individuals or to those companies. So the other thing, hearkening back to the beginning of the talk here, the other thing that has really changed with these changing expectations from people is that people do not want to hear things or get an email from you about things you ought to know they don't care about. So, for instance, if they remember back and you check something and that you didn't want the newsletters and all of a sudden you start getting those newsletters, you might just get unsubscribed. You might get a little nastygram on Instagram or social in some way, right? Why are they doing that? Well, they told you not to do that. And the thing that they have control over with you is your reputation on social media. So it's just a really simple, easy way for you to get back at them. In the end, this is a really incredible opportunity because if you're using this matrix, you're using the things that you're learning about people as you interact with them, you can learn about what they really want to hear from you about. And if you know what they want to hear about, you know what motivates them. You know what can take them from an ally to an advocate. And that's really what it's all about. And I think, that is kind of, in the outside world, there's this unicorn that investors are going after, right? Uber's the next unicorn, or WeWork is the next unicorn. In this room here, I think the next unicorn is taking the employee who's just been on the job for a little bit, who's now an owner, doesn't know what that means, and transforms them into this incredibly highly motivated individual, this employee owner, who's out there evangelizing for you. That's the unicorn. Employees that are really engaged. And not just, like Matt said yesterday, not just engaged, but living kind of an experience that is greater than the normal one that they're used to. So this last bullet point is key, and it links up to something that I talked about earlier. Knowing what your stakeholders want and somehow bringing it into your company's strategy or your company's communications, their plan, and then letting them know that you've done that. What happens when someone shares an idea with you, you recognize that, wow, that's a great idea, and then later on when you come back and say, hey, this is what I did with your great idea, or this is what we did with your great idea, what does that do? That builds loyalty, that builds passion, long-term motivation and energy for you to get that employee to do what you need them to do. As I kind of come into the end here, I want to just kind of leave you with a simple agenda that you can use to potentially innovate. It's hard for me to say that this is what I do is innovative. My business professor they would beat it home in me that there was nothing that this external affairs guy did that isn't rare. that is durable, et cetera, right? These kind of key things you need for innovation. But in the end, innovation and to innovate are different. To innovate is to take a different perspective and use it to apply to an uncommon or maybe even a common problem. So just some kind of an agenda here to use as you leave, or we get into Q&A rather. So the effective modern external affairs organization does a few things really, really well. It identifies its stakeholders and the people who care about their business, and it monitors them, it profiles them, puts them into a CRM, and treats them just like you would a customer, right? Does anybody use a CRM here that tracks their customers, their engagements? Those same tactics you need to use for the external world. Does your state senator care about your work? Does your federal representatives, do they care about your work, et cetera? Keeping track of that information is essential. Explore non-market forces. Take a look outside the firm. Don't focus just internally. See what your state legislature might be doing to impact your business. Take a look at the community where you may operate your plant and understand, are there issues of equity and racial justice beginning to rise up that may impact the inside dynamics of your firm? Study those things and you'll be better off because they are already impacting your firm in ways that you might not understand. Reconsider your organizational structure. For some, this may be as simple as just saying, maybe our community affairs director or our community affairs manager should have a larger scope of work or at least be responsible for taking a different look out into the world. So reconsider some of these organizational structures and see if embedding some of these thoughts might require a new person or a reorganization of the way you're built today. Shape the regulatory environment. This might not make sense for everyone, but if you're a manufacturer, even a professional services firm, and here's a great example of how you might need to shape the regulatory or government policy. In Chicago, we have and this is where I'm from, we have a great downtown central business district, thousands of professional services firms in the central business district. But you go out across the whole city, there's all sorts of other little pockets of business that folks don't even really realize are there. And the city is now considering having a professional services tax on businesses. And if you asked the average small business owner in Chicago, actually they just did, 10% of those small business owners had any idea that there could potentially be a business tax put on them during this budget planning session. I'm happy to say that that's not going to happen, but eventually it's going to need to happen just because of the fiscal situation of the city. So how do you shape that? If I know or you know it's going to happen, but it didn't happen today, that means something's going to be happening 2-3 years from now where you actually have an opportunity right now to shape that. So influences government policy that we were just talking about. One important thing to do, both with your employees and the external world, is understand their political footprint. What do I mean by that? If you were to give me your home address, I could tell you, obviously, who your president is, your 2 senators, your federal representative, your state representative, your state senator. But then if you live in Illinois, or really any other company, but Illinois is our state, but Illinois is the worst, there are at least 10 other political subdivisions of people that are elected underneath that. Your mayor, your city council, your elected school boards, your wastewater district, your metropolitan reclamation district, et cetera, all of those entities have impacts on your business. And often most people have no idea of the policy making that is coming, especially as it relates to water. So just a little free tip is, if you are in the business of dealing with water in any way for your businesses, be prepared for some policy debates that you should participate in. And lastly, just simply know that there's some value that this can capture for the enterprise. And that value can be economic, it can be emotional, it can be spiritual, but in the end, you actually can create value by going out and talking to real people and bringing that intelligence back into your business. And hopefully, you can make that something that helps you grow. So with that said, I'd love to take some questions and see if there were any thoughts folks wanted to share. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I appreciate it. You have a great rest of the conference and safe travels home. Thanks.